My name is Gabriel Thorne, and I hear confessions from dead people. The church assigned me this duty 3 years ago when they discovered my particular gift. Most priests can only minister to the living, but I can hear the voices of those who died with unfinished business, souls trapped between salvation and damnation. The rules started simple enough. Father Augustine handed me a single sheet of paper on my first day. Rule 1. Never interrupt the dead during confession. Rule 2. Never ask questions about their death. Rule 3. Never touch the confessional booth after sunset. Rule 4. Never speak the names of the dead outside the booth. Follow these exactly, Father Augustine said, his weathered hands folding the paper. The church has learned these rules through centuries of trial and error. Break them, and you endanger not just yourself, but the souls in your care. I thought 4 rules seemed reasonable. I was wrong. The confessional booth sits in the basement of St. Bartholomew's Cathedral, far from the main sanctuary where regular parishioners come for their weekly absolution. My booth is older, carved from black walnut that has absorbed decades of whispered secrets. The wood grain forms patterns that seem to shift when I'm not looking directly at them, but I've learned not to stare too long. My first confession came from a woman named Eleanor Hartwell. She had died in 1847 during a cholera outbreak, but her voice reached me clearly through the wooden screen. "Father, I have sinned," she began, her words carrying the weight of century-old guilt. "I poisoned my husband's soup with mercury from our thermometer. He died thinking it was the cholera, but it was me. I wanted his money for my sister's medical treatments." I listened without speaking, my hands folded in my lap. Her confession lasted 47 minutes. When she finished, I granted her absolution, and I felt her presence fade like smoke dispersing in wind. The booth grew warmer, and I knew her soul had found peace. That was the easy part. The dead don't come politely. They arrive at all hours, their voices cutting through whatever I'm doing. I might be eating breakfast when suddenly I hear, "Father, I need to confess." I'll be reading scripture, and a voice will interrupt, demanding my attention. The living make appointments. The dead make demands. After my first month, Father Augustine visited with a second sheet of paper. Rule 5. Never refuse a confession, regardless of the hour. "Why the additional rule?" I asked. Father Augustine's eyes looked tired. "Because 3 nights ago, a soul was lost forever when Father Morrison turned away a confession to finish his dinner. The church cannot afford such losses." I accepted the new rule without argument. What choice did I have? The confessions grew more frequent. Every day brought new voices, new guilts, new sins that had festered in the space between life and death. A banker who embezzled from widows' accounts. A mother who drowned her infant daughter in a wash basin. A doctor who deliberately gave wrong medications to patients he disliked. Each confession lasted longer than the previous one, as if the weight of unspoken guilt grew heavier with time. I began sleeping in the basement, on a small cot near the confessional. It was easier than running downstairs every time a soul demanded my attention. The basement had no windows, no way to track day or night except by the church bells that rang every hour above. 3 months into my assignment, I met Thomas Aldrich. Thomas had died in 1923, and his confession began normally enough. He had been a pharmacist who sold diluted medicines to increase his profits. Sick children died because their medications were too weak to help them. A reasonable sin for someone seeking absolution. But Thomas was different. His voice carried an odd quality, like someone speaking through water, and he knew things he shouldn't know. "Father Gabriel," he said, using my name though I had never introduced myself. "You're wondering why your predecessor left so suddenly." I had been wondering exactly that. Father Morrison's departure was abrupt and unexplained. One day he was hearing confessions. The next day he was transferred to a monastery in Alaska with no forwarding address. Father Morrison broke Rule 3, Thomas continued. He touched the booth after sunset, just once. His fingertip brushed the doorframe as he left late one evening. What happened to him? I asked, then immediately regretted speaking. Rule 1 was clear about not interrupting. Thomas laughed, a sound like glass breaking underwater. He started hearing confessions from the living Father, people who were still alive but would die the next day, or the next week, or the next year. He heard their future sins, their upcoming guilts. It drove him to try preventing their deaths, changing their fates. The church couldn't allow that. My mouth went dry. Why are you telling me this? Because, Thomas said, I think you deserve to know what you're really doing here. His confession continued for 6 hours. By the end, I understood that my role was more complex than Father Augustine had explained. I wasn't just offering absolution to trapped souls. I was serving as a filter, determining which souls deserved salvation and which deserved something else entirely. The something else was never explained to me. After Thomas, the confessions changed. The dead began sharing information about their fellow deceased, creating an intricate web of connections that spanned centuries. Sarah Mackenzie, who died in 1889, told me about her husband's business partner, who had died 20 years earlier. That partner, when he came to confess, revealed details about a murder that happened in 1834. The murderer, when his turn came, connected to a scandal from 1799. Each soul knew the sins of others. Each confession revealed larger patterns of guilt and complicity that stretched back to the cathedral's founding. I realized I wasn't just hearing individual confessions. I was mapping the moral history of my entire community. The work became exhausting. Some nights I would hear 12 or 15 confessions, each lasting several hours. My eyes grew red from lack of sleep. My voice became hoarse from granting so much absolution. I lost weight because I forgot to eat during the longer sessions. Father Augustine brought me meals occasionally, but he never stayed long. He would set a tray beside my cot and leave quickly, as if my presence made him uncomfortable. I noticed he always wore gloves when handling anything I had touched. 6 months into my assignment, I received the next rule. Father Augustine didn't visit this time. Instead, I found a new sheet of paper slipped under the confessional door while I was hearing a confession from Margaret Foster, a woman who had killed her 3 children in 1902. Rule 6. Never grant absolution to anyone who died by their own hand. This rule troubled me more than the others. Suicide was already considered a mortal sin by the church, but refusing absolution felt cruel. These souls were often the most desperate, the most in need of forgiveness. The first test came 2 days later. "Father, I have sinned," a young man's voice said. His name was David Crane, and he had died in 1987. I jumped from the bell tower because I couldn't handle the guilt anymore. I had been stealing from my church's collection plate to buy drugs. When they caught me, I couldn't face the shame. His confession was heartbreaking. David had grown up poor, turned to drugs as an escape, and made increasingly bad decisions to feed his addiction. The theft was his lowest point, but he had planned to confess and make amends before he was discovered. "I jumped because I thought God would never forgive me," David said. "But now I'm hoping maybe you can." I sat in silence for a long time. Rule 6 was clear, but David's situation felt different from typical suicide cases. He died from despair, not malice. His sin was theft, not self-murder. But rules were rules. "I cannot grant you absolution," I said quietly. David's presence didn't fade like the others. Instead, it grew heavier, pressing against the walls of the confessional like accumulated weight. The temperature dropped noticeably. "Please," David said. "I've been waiting 36 years for this chance." "I'm sorry," I replied. "The rules are clear." David screamed then. a sound that seemed to come from the wood itself rather than through the air. The confessional shook, the carved panels creaking under some unseen pressure. I pressed my hands against my ears, but the sound came from inside my head. When it stopped, David was gone. But something had changed in the booth. The wood grain patterns were different now, more chaotic, and I could smell something burning, though I saw no flame. I found Father Augustine in his office later that evening. "Rule 6 is problematic," I told him. "What happens to souls I refuse?" Father Augustine didn't look up from his paperwork. "They go where they belong." Which is where? Not our concern. I wanted to press the issue, but Father Augustine's tone suggested the conversation was over. I returned to the basement, but sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard David's scream echoing through my memory. The pattern continued. More souls came seeking absolution for suicides, and I turned them all away per Rule 6. Each refusal made the confessional feel smaller, stuffier. The smell of burning grew stronger, though I never found its source. 2 weeks after David, I received another rule. Rule 7. Never ask about the fate of souls denied absolution. This rule arrived differently than the others. Instead of a paper slipped under the door, I found the words carved into the wooden screen separating me from the penitent's side. The carving was fresh, the wood shavings still scattered on the floor. I ran my fingers over the carved letters, feeling their sharp edges. Someone had worked quickly but precisely to create this message. But who? And when? I had been in the confessional booth for the past 18 hours straight, hearing back-to-back confessions. No one could have entered the penitent's side without me noticing, unless they had entered while I was focused on a particularly absorbing confession, or unless they hadn't entered from outside at all. That thought disturbed me more than I wanted to admit. I checked the booth carefully, looking for any other changes. The wood grain patterns seemed more organized now, almost like text written in a language I couldn't read. The burning smell was stronger near the carved rule, as if the wood had been branded rather than cut. My next confession came from a priest. "Father, I have sinned," the voice said. "My name is Father Bennett Morrison." I recognized the name immediately. Father Morrison was my predecessor, the one who had been transferred to Alaska. According to the church records, he was very much alive. "Father Morrison," I said carefully, "you're not dead." "Aren't I?" he replied. "I touched the booth after sunset, just as Thomas told you. After that, I started hearing confessions from people who hadn't died yet. Do you know what it's like to know that Mrs. Henderson will die next Tuesday from a stroke? Or that young Timothy Walsh will be hit by a car on his way to school next month?" I remained silent, remembering Rule 1 about not interrupting. "I tried to save them," Father Morrison continued. "I warned Mrs. Henderson about her blood pressure. I convinced Timothy's mother to drive him to school instead of letting him walk. I thought I was doing God's work." His voice carried exhaustion that seemed to span years. But preventing their deaths didn't erase their future sins. It just delayed them. Mrs. Henderson lived another month, long enough to poison her neighbor's dog out of spite. Timothy grew up to become a burglar. Every life I saved led to new sins, new guilt, new suffering. I wanted to ask questions, but Rule 1 held me back. The church transferred me here to confess because I had disrupted the natural order. But I'm not seeking absolution, Father Gabriel. I'm giving you a warning. The temperature in the booth dropped again, just like with David. "The rules aren't protecting you," Father Morrison said. "They're protecting everyone else from you. Each soul you hear, each absolution you grant or deny, it changes you. You're becoming something the church can use but can't control. And when you become too dangerous, they'll send someone to hear your confession too." Father Morrison's presence faded, leaving me alone with questions I wasn't allowed to ask. I spent the rest of that night thinking about what he had said. The rules had seemed arbitrary before, but now I saw them as carefully constructed barriers. They weren't just protecting me from the dead, they were protecting the living from whatever I was becoming. The next morning, I found 2 more rules carved into the confessional screen. Rule 8. Never leave the cathedral grounds while assigned to this duty. Rule 9. Never discuss your assignment with anyone outside the church hierarchy. I hadn't tried to leave the cathedral, but now the option was explicitly forbidden. The church was closing off my remaining connections to the outside world. That afternoon brought my most disturbing confession yet. "Father, I have sinned," a child's voice said. The speaker couldn't have been older than 8 or 9. "My name is Lucy Brennan, and I died yesterday." Yesterday. This was the first soul I had encountered who died so recently. "I was playing hide-and-seek with my brother," Lucy continued. "I hid in the old refrigerator in our garage. The door got stuck and I couldn't get out. I died from not having enough air." Her voice was clear and bright, untainted by the centuries of guilt that weighed down my other penitents. She sounded like any child telling a story about their day. "I don't really have sins to confess," Lucy said. "Mama always said I was her good girl, but the man in white robes told me I needed to come here before I could see Jesus." A man in white robes. I wore black. The other priests at St. Bartholomew's wore black. Who wore white? "What did this man look like?" I asked, forgetting Rule 1 again. "He was very tall and very pale," Lucy said. "He had marks on his hands like Jesus, but they were fresh. And he smelled like the stuff Daddy uses to clean his tools. Bleach, or some other chemical." "He told me you would help me get to heaven," Lucy continued. "But first I had to tell you about something I saw." I waited, my heart racing despite my training. "When I was hiding in the refrigerator before I died, I saw through the garage window. There was a man digging a hole in our backyard. A big hole, like for planting a tree. But he put something wrapped in plastic in the hole instead." My hands began to shake. This wasn't a confession. This was testimony. "The man looked like Father Augustine," Lucy said. "But that can't be right because Father Augustine is nice. He comes to dinner at our house sometimes. Mama says he's helping Daddy with church business." The confessional seemed to shrink around me. Everything clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The rules weren't just protecting me from spiritual corruption. They were ensuring my silence about what I learned during confessions. And Lucy wasn't here seeking absolution. She was here because someone wanted her testimony buried with church secrets. "Can you help me get to heaven now?" Lucy asked. I stared at the carved rules surrounding me, each one designed to limit my actions, my questions, my ability to act on information I received. Rule 4 prevented me from speaking Lucy's name outside the booth. Rule 9 prevented me from discussing what I learned with anyone outside church hierarchy. And Father Augustine was church hierarchy. "Father?" Lucy's voice was smaller now, uncertain. "Are you still there?" I realized I had a choice to make. I could grant Lucy absolution and let her soul find peace, knowing her testimony would die with her. Or I could refuse, sending her to whatever fate awaited denied souls, but potentially preserving some chance that justice might be served. The rules were clear about what I should do, but for the first time since accepting this assignment, I wondered if following the rules was actually serving God's will. "Father?" Lucy asked again. "I'm scared." I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could speak, I heard footsteps on the basement stairs. Someone was coming down to check on me. Through the carved screen, I could see a figure in white robes approaching the confessional, the man Lucy had described. As the footsteps grew closer, I had to make my decision about Lucy's soul, and I had to make it fast. "Lucy," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I grant you absolution for any sins you may have committed. Go in peace." Her presence faded instantly, like a candle being blown out. I felt the familiar warmth that meant a soul had found rest, but this time, it felt different. Hollow. As if I had just helped someone escape rather than find salvation. The footsteps stopped outside the confessional booth. Through the wooden screen, I could see white fabric and pale hands. The figure stood perfectly still, waiting. I knew I should step out and face whoever was there, but something kept me frozen in place. Maybe it was the memory of Lucy's frightened voice, or the growing certainty that nothing about my assignment was what it seemed. "Father Gabriel," a voice called from outside the booth. It was smooth and measured, like someone reading from a script. "Please step out. We need to discuss your recent performance." The voice didn't belong to Father Augustine. This was someone new, someone whose authority felt different, more absolute. I remained seated, my hands gripping the armrests of my chair. "I'm currently hearing confessions," I called back, though the confessional was empty except for me. "No, you're not." The voice carried complete certainty. "You just granted absolution to Lucy Brennan, and her confession has ended. Step out." They had been listening. The realization hit me like cold water. Someone had been monitoring my confessions, possibly from the beginning. The rules weren't just guidelines, they were surveillance protocols. I stood slowly and pushed open the confessional door. The figure in white robes stood 6 feet away, hands clasped behind his back. His face was ordinary, except for his eyes, which seemed too pale, almost colorless. The marks Lucy had mentioned were visible on his hands, small round scars that looked fresh despite what must have been years of healing. "My name is Cardinal Voss," he said. "I oversee the church's specialized ministries. Your ministry, specifically." I had never heard of Cardinal Voss, but his presence commanded immediate respect. Or fear. It was hard to tell the difference. "Cardinal," I said, bowing my head slightly. "How can I help you?" "By following the rules," he replied. "You've been asking questions during confessions. Questions are forbidden for good reason." I was trying to understand. "Understanding is not your role." Cardinal Voss stepped closer, and I caught the chemical smell Lucy had mentioned. Bleach mixed with something else, something medical. "Your role is to listen, absolve, and forget, nothing more." He pulled a final sheet of paper from his robes and handed it to me. The paper felt different from the others, heavier somehow. Rule 10. Never remember the details of any confession after granting absolution. I stared at the rule, my mind racing. How can I forget what I've heard? "The same way you've been forgetting," Cardinal Voss said. "Haven't you noticed how difficult it is to recall specific confessions from more than a week ago? The details fade, don't they? Names become unclear, sins blend together." He was right. I had attributed the memory loss to exhaustion, but now I realized it was something else entirely. Something deliberate. "What have you been giving me?" I asked. Cardinal Voss smiled, the expression somehow more unsettling than his earlier seriousness. "Communion wine with a special blessing. Father Augustine has been very careful about your spiritual nutrition." Drugged. They had been drugging me to ensure I forgot the confessions. But something had gone wrong recently, or my tolerance had built up, because I was remembering more than they intended. "Lucy Brennan's confession troubles us," Cardinal Voss continued. "She mentioned seeing something that could cause unnecessary complications for the church's work in the community." "What kind of work?" "The kind that requires absolute discretion." He moved to the confessional booth and ran his scarred hand along the carved rules. "Father Gabriel, you've served admirably, but your assignment here is ending." My heart started beating faster. "Ending how?" "You'll be transferred to a monastery, somewhere quiet, where you can contemplate your service and enjoy well-deserved rest. The head monk there specializes in helping priests transition away from demanding assignments." The way he said "transition" made it sound permanent, final. What about the souls who need confession? I asked. We'll send someone new, someone younger, more manageable. Cardinal Voss gestured toward the stairs. Shall we go pack your things? I looked back at the confessional booth, at the carved rules that had controlled my life for so many months. Something inside me rebelled against leaving, against letting them silence what I had learned. I'd like to stay for one more confession, I said, to properly close out my service. Cardinal Voss's pale eyes narrowed. That won't be necessary. Please. It would mean a lot to me, spiritually. He studied my face for a long moment, as if trying to read my intentions. Finally, he nodded. Very well. One final confession, but make it quick. He stepped back, allowing me to return to the confessional booth. I closed the door and sat down, my mind working frantically. I needed to find a way to preserve what I had learned, to ensure Lucy's testimony wasn't buried with my departure. Then I heard a familiar voice through the screen. Father, I have sinned. It was Thomas Aldrich, the pharmacist who had first warned me about Father Morrison's fate. But this time, his voice carried urgency instead of casual malice. Thomas, I said quietly, they're removing me from this assignment. I know, Thomas replied. I can see Cardinal Voss waiting outside. We don't have much time. What should I do? Listen carefully. The confessions you've heard aren't random. The church has been using you to map the spiritual connections in this community, to identify which families carry the most guilt, the most secrets. That information is valuable to people who want leverage over others. I felt sick. They're blackmailing people? Worse, they're selecting them. The families with the darkest secrets are being approached by church representatives. Some are offered forgiveness in exchange for donations. Others are offered silence in exchange for favors. And some. Thomas paused, and I heard Cardinal Voss shifting impatiently outside the booth. Some are eliminated, Thomas finished. Like Lucy's father. He discovered financial irregularities in the church's accounts, money being funneled to private accounts. So they arranged his death and made it look like an accident. Lucy witnessed Father Augustine burying the evidence. How do you know all this? Because the dead talk to each other, Father Gabriel. We share information across centuries, and we've been watching the church's activities for decades. You're not the first confessor for the dead. There have been 12 before you, all transferred to monasteries when they learned too much. None of them were ever heard from again. My hands began to shake. I was trapped between my duty to the church and my growing understanding of what that duty actually entailed. Time's up, Cardinal Voss called from outside. Finish your confession. Thomas, I whispered. What happens if I refuse to go with him? Then you'll have an accident too, but there might be another way. What? Grant me absolution, but remember my confession. Don't let them drug you anymore. When you get to the monastery, find a way to contact the outside world. Tell them about Lucy, about what Father Augustine buried in her backyard. Let the living investigate what the dead have witnessed. It was a dangerous plan. Refusing the church's drugged wine would make it obvious that I was no longer compliant. But it might be my only chance to ensure justice for Lucy and her father. Father Gabriel. Cardinal Voss's voice carried clear warning now. I grant you absolution, I told Thomas quickly. Go in peace and pray for me. Thomas's presence faded, but his final words lingered in the air. Remember everything. I opened the confessional door to find Cardinal Voss standing much closer than before, his pale eyes studying my face intently. That took longer than necessary, he said. The soul was troubled. It required extra care. Cardinal Voss nodded, but his expression remained suspicious. Come, your transportation is waiting. I followed him up the basement stairs, through the main cathedral, and out to the front steps where a black sedan waited. Father Augustine stood beside the car, holding a small travel bag. Your belongings, Father Augustine said, handing me the bag. His voice was kind, paternal, exactly as it had always been. Looking at him now, it was hard to believe he was capable of murder. "Father Augustine," I said carefully, "thank you for your guidance during my assignment. You've served admirably, Gabriel. The monastery will be good for you. Brother Francis runs a very peaceful community." Something about the way he emphasized peaceful made my skin crawl. Cardinal Voss opened the car door and gestured for me to get in. As I approached the vehicle, I made a decision that would either save me or doom me. "Actually," I said, stopping just short of the car, "I've realized I left something important in the confessional. Could I retrieve it quickly?" Cardinal Voss's eyes narrowed to slits. "What did you leave?" "My rosary. My grandmother's rosary. It has great sentimental value." Father Augustine looked sympathetic. "Of course, Gabriel. We can wait a moment." But Cardinal Voss stepped between me and the cathedral entrance. "I'm sure the monastery can provide you with a rosary." "Please," I said, putting as much earnestness into my voice as possible. "It's the only thing I have left of her." After a tense moment, Cardinal Voss stepped aside. "Make it quick." I hurried back into the cathedral, down the basement stairs, and into the confessional booth. But instead of looking for a non-existent rosary, I pulled out my pen and began writing on the back of Rule 10. Lucy Brennan witnessed Father Augustine burying evidence in her family's backyard after her father's murder. Check the garden behind 1247 Maple Street. Ask about church financial records. I folded the paper small and slipped it into my shoe, between the insole and my foot. Then I grabbed an old rosary that had been left in the confessional and hurried back upstairs. "Found it," I said, showing them the rosary. Cardinal Voss looked relieved. "Good. Now let's go." This time I got into the car without protest. As we drove away from St. Bartholomew's Cathedral, I watched it disappear in the rear window and wondered if I would ever see it again. The monastery was a 3-hour drive through increasingly remote countryside. Cardinal Voss sat beside me in the back seat, maintaining uncomfortable silence for most of the journey. Father Augustine rode in the front passenger seat, occasionally making pleasant small talk with the driver about weather and local news. As we traveled, I thought about all the confessions I had heard, all the souls I had granted absolution or turned away. Thomas was right. The details were connected in ways I hadn't understood. The church hadn't just been collecting confessions, they had been mapping sins across generations, identifying patterns of guilt and shame that could be exploited. And I had been their unwitting accomplice. The monastery appeared around a bend in the mountain road just as the sun was setting. It was a stark building, all gray stone and narrow windows, surrounded by a high wall topped with what looked like broken glass. The sign by the gate read, "St. Jude's Retreat for Spiritual Contemplation." St. Jude, the patron saint of lost causes. "Here we are," Cardinal Voss said as our car pulled through the gate. "Your new home." Brother Francis met us at the entrance. He was a small, thin man with nervous eyes and hands that shook slightly when he spoke. Everything about him suggested someone who had seen too much and learned to keep quiet about it. "Welcome, Father Gabriel," Brother Francis said. "We've prepared a lovely room for you. Very quiet, very private." Cardinal Voss handed Brother Francis a sealed envelope. "Father Gabriel's medical instructions," he said. "Please follow them exactly. Medical instructions. More drugs, no doubt. Stronger ones this time." "Of course," Brother Francis said, tucking the envelope into his robes. "We take excellent care of our residents." As they led me inside, I noticed that all the windows had bars on them. The doors had locks on the outside rather than the inside. And the other monks I saw moved with the slow, placid expressions of people under heavy sedation. This wasn't a monastery. It was a prison. My room was small but comfortable, with a single bed, a desk, and a crucifix on the wall. Brother Francis showed me where everything was, including the small window that looked out on the monastery's garden. "Dinner is at 6, Brother Francis said. We eat together in the common room. Very social, very healing. After he left, I heard the lock click from outside. I waited until full darkness, then carefully removed the paper from my shoe. By moonlight, I read what I had written about Lucy's testimony. This was the only evidence that might lead to justice for her and her father. But how could I get it to the outside world from a locked room in an isolated monastery? I spent the night thinking, and by morning I had a plan. It was risky, but it was better than letting the truth die with me. At breakfast, I met the other residents of St. Jude's. There were 7 other priests, all in various stages of sedated compliance. But one of them, Father Rodriguez, seemed more alert than the others. When I caught his eye, he gave me the slightest nod toward the window. After breakfast, during our mandatory garden time, Father Rodriguez approached me. "New arrival," he said quietly, pretending to examine a rose bush. "How long did you serve as confessor?" "You know about that?" "I was confessor number 9, he said. 2 years ago. Been trying to find a way out ever since." "How many of us are there here?" 4. The others have been here longer, too medicated to be useful now. He glanced around to make sure Brother Francis wasn't watching. "But I've been refusing my evening medication for 3 months, hiding the pills. I'm almost clear-headed enough to attempt an escape." I showed him the paper with Lucy's information. "This needs to reach the police." Father Rodriguez read it quickly, then nodded. "There's a postal worker who delivers mail to the monastery twice a week. Sister Marie in the kitchen sometimes gives him cookies. If we could get this note to her." "How?" "Leave it under your dinner plate tonight. I'll retrieve it and pass it to Sister Marie. She's not fully compliant with their program, still asks questions." It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was the only option we had. That evening, I palmed the note during dinner and slipped it under my plate as instructed. Father Rodriguez managed to retrieve it when we cleared our dishes. 3 days later, Brother Francis's routine was disrupted by visitors. Through my barred window, I watched police cars pull up to the monastery gates. They had found whatever Father Augustine had buried in Lucy's backyard. Within a week, the story broke in the newspapers that Sister Marie smuggled to us. Father Augustine had been arrested for murder and embezzlement. Cardinal Voss had disappeared. The church was launching a full investigation into the Confessor program. St. Jude's Monastery was raided a month later. They found medical records showing systematic drugging of residents, forged transfer documents, and evidence of other cover-ups. Brother Francis confessed to everything in exchange for a reduced sentence. I was released along with the other surviving confessors, but the damage was extensive. 2 of my fellow priests never recovered their full mental capacity. Father Rodriguez and I were the lucky ones. The church officially disbanded the Confessor for the Dead program, claiming it had been corrupted by rogue elements. They offered substantial settlements to all of us in exchange for our silence about the spiritual aspects of our experiences. I took the money and moved far away, to a small parish in Vermont, where I serve regular parishioners with regular sins. No more voices from beyond. No more rules carved in wood. No more questions about which souls deserve salvation. But sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in my new church, I hear whispers that might be wind through the rafters, or might be something else entirely. Voices thanking me for remembering when I was supposed to forget. Voices telling me that justice, even delayed, still matters to the dead. I never answer them back. Some rules I've learned are worth keeping.